My name is Francisca Davis from Connected Health, a subsidiary of Wavelink. Joining me today from Medigate is Steve Woods, a Principal Healthcare Solution Engineer for Medigate, dialing in from Perth. Steve will introduce himself in a moment, but I'll quickly run through a few housekeeping items before the presentation starts. Firstly, if you have any questions for Steve during the session, I encourage you to enter these into the GoToWebinar control panel on the right of your screen, and I'll do my best to have this answered for you today. In the control panel, you'll also find a PDF handout which you can download now. The session will be recorded with the video to be made available in the coming days via email. I will now hand the microphone to Steve. Over to you, Steve.
Lovely, Francisca. Thank you very much. Hi, everybody. Steve Woods here, calling in from Perth. Today, we're going to go through a few topics. The first is the threats that we're seeing, I guess, industry-wide, and those that are specifically targeting healthcare. The impacts that we are seeing, particularly with some changes in legislation that are coming out from the US, some of the lessons that we've learnt. And also I wanted to finish with some customer stories and some Q&A. So in a previous webinar, I touched on a couple of customer stories, and the feedback was that people love to hear about what's happening in other organizations. So for today's session, I actually have expanded and got a number of different topics that we can cover off. So before we get started, a little introduction about myself and why I'm here. As you can tell from the fact that my beard is multicolored now, I've been around in IT for a while. I have experience in a range of different industries. So that is in healthcare, so teaching and non-teaching hospitals. I've also been fortunate to be able to work in both the Northern and Southern Hemisphere and in a range of roles, so system integrators and vendor roles. In my current role, I get to work with a number of healthcare providers across APAC. I have a background in networking and security and pre and post sales, so it's really good to be able to talk to customers and understand different parts of the mechanisms that make up healthcare environments. I've also done some first-hand research. So this photo was taken almost 2 years ago to the day, following doing my knee and breaking my wrist at the same time. You'll be pleased to know that I managed to get a free carpal tunnel out of it. Now, before I go and talk a little bit, I wanted to include a couple of poll questions early on in the webinar, and there'll be some more coming. Now, the first one is actually related to Star Wars Day, which is only appropriate given it's International Star Wars Day. And I promise I will relate it back to the topic. So while you're answering those, I get to have a drink. No cheating and Googling either. So after this poll, there'll be another little quick poll, and I want to use those as some talking points when we lead in, particular into healthcare. So everyone should have their poll on their screen. Francisca, we'll give them another 10 seconds or so to answer, and then we'll need to move on. Okay, can we move on to the next poll, please? Okay, so 46%, beautiful, got it right. Excellent. Okay, can we go to the next poll as well, please? Okay, so the first question was related to Star Wars. Obviously, Disney invested quite a substantial amount of money in buying the rights for Star Wars off George Lucas. This one is related to actually home insurance. So my question I'm really asking is, over the last 3 years, the cost of building a house and the length of time it takes to build a house has significantly increased. So my question is, from a personal point of view, who has actually increased, decreased, or maintained their current insurance level, either through choice or they didn't actually review it? I'm very curious to see what the audience has chosen for this, and I want to take the Star Wars topic and this topic together. So we'll give you 10 more seconds to answer that. Perfect, Francisco, we'll move now. Increased, decreased. Perfect. Excellent. That's really interesting. I didn't increase mine, but I had to increase my contents insurance. The reason that I asked those two questions, although it might seem a little strange linking those two together, but really what I wanted to do was talk about risk versus cost. So obviously when Disney was spending $4 billion, there would have been a pretty substantial business case. Now in hindsight, they can look back and say that 4 out of the 5 Star Wars movies that they produced had gross revenue of over $1 billion. So it's a good investment decision. But the interesting thing when we talk about, say, our home insurance is we're making these decisions as well, as in what to invest in and what not to invest in. And later in the presentation, we'll talk a little bit about how cyber criminals are making these same decisions about what to invest their money in and what not to invest their money in. So really what we're doing, say from Disney's point of view, is balancing out the risk versus the cost. So financial cost, reputation cost. But when we get to healthcare, we have people's lives in our hands as well. So the challenge that we have is weighing up the risk, not only in terms of reputation and obviously monetary, but also the risk to patient lives. That changes the balance of how things work. And we've seen that in the way that attacks are going out. So if we look at, in particular, probably the last 10 to 12 years, the area that I want to focus on in this chart, and you may have seen something that's very similar, it is around 12, 13 years ago now. There's two that I want to call out. So the first one is Stuxnet. So for those that are not familiar with it, it was a very sophisticated worm that was believed to be state-sponsored and targeting Iran's nuclear program. The second one is CryptoLocker. So that was a Trojan, and it netted about $3 million from victims, and its success, so CryptoWall, netted $18 million. Now, the reason I'm calling out those two, for me, Stuxnet showed that just because something is isolated doesn't mean it's secure. And the crypto lockers were really the monetization of basically viruses and Trojans. So as you can see, the result of those, there's a massive increase from that point on. The next one that I want to highlight is WannaCry. Now, WannaCry was very big, but it hit healthcare in particular very difficult. And it was actually the catalyst from the founding of Medigate. So the founders were looking for a particularly challenging area. WannaCry came out, hit healthcare, and that was the foundation for the Medigate platform that we see and have today. Now, the thing is that cybercrime is a business. So what we've seen is there are organizations that they're getting more income from this than they are from other drugs. Okay, so if it hasn't already, cybercrime will surpass other criminal activity. The thing is, with criminal activity, if you follow the money, you can see where they're targeting. So this is a stat from the last year in terms of the global, in terms of cyber attacks. And what we saw is a general decline across the 4 quarters. but not for healthcare. So 328% increase. Okay, criminals don't invest money for no reason. They run it like a business. They'll go after where they think they can get return. And the key is that we're not dealing with one type of organisation either. There is specializations, so you can get basically crime as a service, whether it's ransomware, denial of service, phishing kits, malware kits, etc. And there's all the supporting players, so that those that buy and sell access, move money around, etc. So when we're dealing with the cyber criminals, it's not just one group that we're dealing with. Now, the problem is that, particularly in the world we live in today, you see stats and charts like the one I've just shown you thrown around all the time. And after a while, numbers lose their meaning. So I actually have used a data visualization tool, which I found is actually very helpful. So I guess to paraphrase Stalin, one breach is a tragedy, a million is a statistic. But what I want to show you is, let's have a look at it. Looks like visually over the last 12 years in terms of the number of breaches and the size of the data loss. So what we saw from early 2010, 2012 onwards was the number of breaches start to increase and the number of return of those records significantly increase. Now, if we look at the last 6 to 7 years, this is what it looks like. Okay, some significant breaches, lots of them, for some very large organizations that have a number of resources, both in terms of tools and people. So that brings us to the challenge when we see attacks focusing on healthcare, because healthcare is a very rich target. There is a number of reasons why healthcare is basically vulnerable. So it's not only the security maturity and potentially lack of resources and tools. We have rich, valuable data. So healthcare records are very valuable. So they're much more valuable on the black market than a stolen credit card. We have volumes of data. We have the data retention lifetime. And we're also dealing with an industry where medical device manufacturers are very slow to move. So one of the things that I mentioned briefly before was around, I guess, the outdated security models. So, isolated networks or security via obscurity. So in a medical device form, the MDS forms, this quote that's on the screen now is actually directly from an MDS form. So this is showing what the manufacturer thinks in terms of security applies to their device. Now, if I did a poll, I'd get you to have a guess which operating system this runs, but I was going to put you through that. This is actually VxWorks, is the operating system, and it was responsible for quite a lot of vulnerabilities. So the problem that we have, and this is, I guess, one of the triggers around the Patch Act that we're seeing in the US, is we have devices that are manufactured, they're running older operating systems, they're not built with security in mind, and then they sit in an environment for multiple years without updates. And so we get into this state where we have basically a large attack surface. So what we're seeing now is that a number of attacks are against medical and IoT devices. So not just obviously cloud-based applications, but we're seeing things that are being directly targeted. So medical and IoT devices. And the challenge in healthcare is that we're seeing a range of outcomes. So one's longer stays, that's obviously a cost to the hospitals, transfer to other facilities. We saw a lot of that over the last few years, but obviously an increase in mortality rates. Now, mortality rates is a big issue, obviously, for patients, especially if you're it. We saw in the US that there's actually a lawsuit that is underway at the moment through inappropriate or lack of care for a patient during a cyber attack. So the challenge we have is we know it's coming, we know it's targeting healthcare. So what options do we have? So ransomware payments is one, cyber insurance, if you can get it. Obviously legislation is kicking in, as well as all the tools and people and practices that you have. The issue is that we're actually seeing a decrease in what people are actually getting back if they do make the ransom payment. So 69% down to 65 in the last couple of years. Of those, only 2%, down from 8%, got all of their data back. So what it means is we can't rely on insurance, I guess, to help us if we rebuild our house. We can't rely on insurance to help us get everything back. We've also seen that a couple of things I found really interesting. One is that not all data taken from breaches actually appears. So what it's been used for is a good question. But we've also seen, in particular, the Medibank breach. Cyber criminals have no concern about releasing data, and they have no issue in weaponizing it. So they've been taking data on things like abortion, drug history, alcohol, etc., and targeting people. So we have an issue with obviously the data, but we also have issue in terms of patient safety. So if I simplify things a little, when I look at a hospital and the ones that I worked in, so I'm also from a medical family, so my mum was a nurse, my sister's a doctor, so I've loitered around lots of hospitals over my years. If I simplify things down, hospitals really have 3 S's. They have space, so things like wards and beds. They have stuff, so basically resources, so ventilators, PPE, etc. And they have staff, okay, nurses, doctors, orderlies, admin staff, cleaners, etc. And they all function together to provide us care. Now, in the healthcare environment, time is essential. So if we're looking at a number of different things, and I can relate to all 4 of these in my immediate family, whether it's something to do with a heart attack, a stroke, a lung issue, or diabetes, time is really important. Okay, whether it's minutes, hours, days, or weeks. And what we saw, particularly during COVID, was a massive impact on all of these things. So some organizations around the world coped better than others, but they were all under strain. So whether that was the lack of space to be able to have people actually come into the hospital, issues with supplies of stuff or supply chain, and obviously staff were heavily impacted as well. But when we look at a hospital now, I guess compared to when I was much younger, is hospitals rely on technology increasingly for everything. In the customers that I've been dealing with in Asia Pacific, just over the last few years, every time they do a refresh of a technology, the new device is network connected. We actually met a couple of vendors in Sydney at the Digital Health Festival last month. They're releasing new medical devices with wireless chips in them, with no understanding of what they want to do with them. They've just been asked to be network connected, and so they're building them without a view as to how they're going to be used. So that technology is not just medical devices, it's our building automation controls, temperature sensors, access to lifts, everything. That technology, if we attack that technology, we're having the same impact that we saw during COVID. So COVID is a perfect, I guess, example of what happens when we're under strain. Anyone that's worked around a hospital for any length of time will know if the IT systems go down, it's an absolute nightmare. Admitting patients, getting results, moving them. We've seen attacks in Europe around the building access, so locking people out of elevators. Most hospitals that I've been in, the wards are on one level, the emergencies on a different level, theatres on a different level. So moving patients between floors is an absolute nightmare. And ultimately, what this means is that we're impacting the ability to produce the care that we need in minutes, days, hours, or weeks. And when we do that, then we have a fundamental issue. And that's what we're seeing now, is that policies in the past have really been focused around confidentiality of patient data. So you've got things like HIPAA and PHI and all of those things. But now we're actually seeing a transition over to resiliency and availability of patient care. So one of the challenges that we have, and this is what I've seen particularly in this role, is there's a general divide between IT and biomedical. How big that gap is really depends on the organisation, but they're very focused on different things. Part of our role is to try and help bring those two teams together, because fundamentally you need both of them working together to be able to secure it. Now, as it is International Star Wars Day, I have thrown in another poll, and I'm going to get Francisca to pop it up now while I get to have another drink. So we'll give them 10 more seconds, Francisca. Okay. How do we go? Excellent. Good to see a lot of people got it right. Excellent. So why don't I ask you a Star Wars question, apart from the fact that it's International Star Wars Day? One of the things I've been looking at over the last couple of years is lessons that we can learn from attacks on healthcare. So from a healthcare point of view, there's lots of things I really like about healthcare. Organisations will work together and share information, unlike other industries which I've worked in, like mining and resources or finance, where they tend not to play nicely with each other. That said, what we want to do is understand more about breaches and lessons we can learn. So the previous question I asked about Star Wars was a bit of a loaded question. 67% of you were right. It was a missile that went down the exhaust chute, but there were a number of things that led up to the fact that it got blown up. And what we actually see is exactly as Malcolm Gladwell points out, that when a plane crashes, it's often 7 consecutive things that have happened in order for the plane to crash. And when we look at cybersecurity, we often see exactly the same thing. It's not just someone walked in the front door and took everything. There's a series of missteps or things that don't happen, and then we hit a problem. We know that we need people, process, and technology, and we know from a technology point of view, and I can say this, having worked for 4 different vendors, is that any vendor that comes in and says that they can do it all themselves is full of something starting with S, and it's not solutions. In the cybersecurity space, you have to play nicely with others. You need to be able to take information from a system, you need to be able to push information to a system, and unless you're working together, it actually isn't that helpful. What we can see is lack of ownership is a particular issue. There's often an elephant in the room in terms of weaknesses, but fundamentally it's the slow response and lack of resources and not being prepared, so having no up-to-date information, so you're scrambling to respond, and that's the issue. Because when we look at an attack versus I guess a response, the tactics of how criminals get into an organization may vary, but the general process is very similar. There will be an initial recon, they'll either phish or they'll use an exploit, they'll get into an environment, and then they're trying to expand horizontally. They'll often target things like backup systems, critical systems, so particularly if they're going to carry out, say, ransomware attacks, first thing you do is go after the backups, okay? And then when they're ready, they launch an attack. But that attack may come a number of weeks or months after they've initially got in. So the challenge is, how do we respond to that? And I like the term of cyber resiliency. cybersecurity seems to be a kind of all or nothing thing. I like resiliency because ultimately we know that at some point someone will get in. So the question is, how do we respond to that? And how do we have some resiliency if it does happen? So the first one is really around identification. So whichever framework you're using, whether it's NIST or other framework, fundamentally, they're trying to do the same thing. Establish a pattern for how you're going to respond. In this case, we're going to assess the risk. We're going to secure things that are really important to us. Obviously, detect if there's any threats. Respond if we find them. And really important, but not all of it, is recovery. Now, the reason that I showed this is a lot of the effort around securing and detecting threats and mitigating those comes from an understanding of what you have and how you assess the risk. Part of the challenge we have is that traditional IT tools are not designed in a healthcare environment for things like medical devices. Now, we know that IoT and medical devices are getting targeted. So how do we know what they are? So what I've done is put an example in here. Okay, so here's an example. We've got a switch with a couple of devices that are plugged into it. MAC address, we know who the manufacturer is, we know what the IP address is. So from an IT scanning point of view, we know a little bit about the device. We can make some guesses maybe as to what it is, but we don't really know. Now, the challenge is that when we look at this, we know it's the same Mac manufacturer, but this device here can actually be a patient monitor. Now, when we look at a patient monitor, when we're looking at it, we're looking at information depending on what context and what role you are. So when I look at it from a networking point of view, obviously care about things like IP and MAC, but I want to know who it's talking to, what VLAN it's on, you know, if there's a tag that I'm associating it with. If I'm looking at it from a security point of view, I want to know what operating system it's running. Is there any PHI on it? Is there any vulnerabilities? If I'm a clinical engineer or biomedical person, I want to know who the manufacturer is. I want to know the serial number. So the information that I want about that device will vary with its role. Now, when I look at the device that's connected at the bottom, same manufacturer, this one is actually an infusion pump. Now, from that point of view, okay, it's an infusion pump and its serial number and how it's connected. So now that I know exactly what they are, now I can assess risk. So when I look at this, what you'll see is I've got the manufacturer, I know what the type of the device is, a bunch of other information with it. And what I can do now is actually go and look at the risk score. So if you can see this one here on your screen highlighted, the Alaris infusion pump has a risk score of 62.1, so a high risk score based on a number of factors. So not just the device itself, an operating system, but how it's connected to the network. If I look at this other device, we'll see that this one has actually a low risk score. Okay, so vital sign monitor and a low risk score. So from a networking point of view, if I treated those two devices as the same device because of their MAC address or their manufacturer of their MAC address, of their NIC card, I may treat them and put them in the same security bucket. But those two devices aren't the same. They have different roles and different security requirements. Okay, so this is the fundamental thing that I think is really important is understanding what you have first. So what I want to do is touch on in the last part of the presentation today. Basically, I'm calling them tales from the trenches. So these are a number of, I guess, different stories from customers, both here in Australia, New Zealand, APAC, and also a couple in the Northern Hemisphere. Just to give you a view of I guess, things that we see in customers. So the first one is around device behavior. So one of the things that's really important to know is when you have a medical device, for example, in this case, you want to know who it's talking to. So this is an Alaris infusion pump. So the device that we saw on the previous screen, it has some known behavior as to what it should talk to from an endpoint point of view and ports and protocols. What we can actually do in the Medigate platform is to actually put a policy against it and look for traffic that deviates from that and obviously raise an alarm. In order to do that, you have to understand what the behavior of the device is. So I wanted to show you an example of what a device looks like when it's compromised. So in this case, we've got a policy compliance, and you can see all the red are basically communication alerts. So this is a device that's been compromised and is talking to things that it shouldn't be. The next one is around the end of life of some dispensing cabinets. So this is actually a customer in the US. They basically were told that the dispensing cabinets were going end of life. They're about 20 to 40,000 US a pop to replace. The challenge for them is they had 150 of them, and obviously they didn't have enough budget in that financial year to replace them. So what are they going to do? So in this case, they actually use the platform and to be able to take the security policy of how the device behaves and push that into their Aruba wireless network. So what they're able to do is prolong the life of that device by effectively ring fencing it. And I think that's important because in the medical environment, we don't always have the option to replace devices. We don't always have the option to patch them, whether that's a patch being available or whether there's a support contract in place. We don't always have the option to go and update them the same way that we can do with a PC, laptop, or a phone. The next one I'm going to highlight, because this is actually not an issue as say in terms of like say a vulnerability, but it's actually two parts of an organization not talking to each other. So in this environment, IT basically did a large wireless upgrade, and as a result of that, a number of the older medical devices actually couldn't connect to that network, and some staff being, I guess, useful and helpful, managed to connect a number of them to the guest network. So in the platform, what they can actually see is the network that the device is actually connected to and what category they're available. So in this case, they're able to work it out. So what this customer actually did is the biomedical team actually did a bunch of research on what their security protocols could be supported by their devices, and they actually put notes in the system against it. So for IT to be able to create a special access for them. This one is an interesting one. I haven't seen this one personally, but this was a colleague of mine who got a frantic call from a customer who had got a call from their legal team. And what they found is in a large hospital, patients were bringing in an Amazon device with them and using that to call home to their family. The challenge obviously being that the devices are always listening and they're in a shared room. So what happened is the legal team basically said to the IT team, you need to go and find this device and get rid of it now. And so what they were able to do is actually search through the system, find the device being Amazon. They were able to find the network location where the device was and include a map of where the device was, and they could actually go and retrieve it straight away from the patient's room. So I thought that was an interesting one, because when I actually checked with another colleague in another part of the world, their hospital actually hands out Amazon Echoes. So depends on, I guess, which lawyers you have. This one is a story just closer to home. This is a customer that we were working with, and they retired a large fleet of devices, and in the system they wanted them removed and purged their history from it. And what we actually found was there were a number of these devices actually still active on the network. And what we were able to do is correlate the fact that they were actively sent on the network with the fact that the asset system, so their CMMS, was reporting these devices as retired. And so correlating those and raising an alert that a device that shouldn't have been used is still being used. This is a customer very local to home. The reason I flagged this one is it was actually an audit finding. So the customer had basically had an audit and were told that medical devices were being found on their corporate network. So the customer obviously wanted to identify quickly which ones they were, and also to be alerted if it happened again. And what we have is that the concept of being able to identify devices and obviously understand what they are. So whether they're a medical device, an IoT device, or an OT device, or a standard IT device, we know which VLANs they're in because we see the information on the network, and we're able to highlight and raise an alert when we saw a device category in a network where it shouldn't have been. So for this customer, it was really important for them because they basically had to go and act very quickly. And so being able to know what the device is, so again, this comes back to identification, what the device is tells them what group they need to go to, because they deal with devices that are brought in, that are mobile between hospitals, but they also deal with pharmacy, they also deal with pathology. So I guess a few different stories, and the one that I want to touch on at the end is nothing to do with cyber, but it's more to do with money. And the reason for that is that obviously in a perfect world, we have unlimited resources and unlimited money. Now, we don't live in that world, so money has to come from somewhere. One of the things that we've seen in customers is the ability to actually identify underutilized devices, and whether that is to be able to move those devices or decrease them, or in this case, they actually were able to renegotiate contracts with their supplier. And it actually led to a savings, and then that money can obviously be used elsewhere within the environment. So the thing that I think is interesting is when we look at cyber, and particularly in a healthcare environment, there's a number of things that add up, but it's not just about identifying a device or applying a policy. It's actually that whole chain, and how do we be resilient about it, and how do we actually work better together. So just to recap, we know that attacks are increasing. We know that cybercrime is big business, and we've definitely seen over the last 2 years that healthcare is a prime target. The challenge that we're having is how do we put those controls in place? Okay, we have to have visibility. We have to be aware of things, because from an IT point of view, so when I worked in hospital, you're very cautious about messing up anything to do with patient care. Okay, so how do we do that safely? And how do we get efficiencies out of what we do have? Because no one's getting lots more money to fix things. And we need a plan. So being resilient. So it's not a case of if, it's a case of when. So we know that at some point we're going to be targeted. How do we respond? And how do we make sure, in particular, that patient care is not impacted? So that is the summary of what we're going to go through today. If you have any questions, you're welcome to ask them through the chat. These are my details. I'll leave this open on the screen, so you can reach out to myself or Luke directly, or any of the Wavelink team. But that's where I'll stop for today, and I'll take any questions. Thank you for your time.
Thanks for your presentation today, Steve. We have received a few questions, so let's just go through some of them now. Just a reminder that if you have any questions, you can type these down onto the question box and the GoToWebinar control panel. So question one, first question comes from Tim. Our systems are quite outdated, but we are currently kicking off a network refresh project, and one of the primary objectives is to implement segmentation. How have you seen other organizations approach this?
Good question. All right, so I've seen customers approach it in a few different ways. I've seen a couple of customers actually procure tools to do it, whether it's a NAC solution or something similar. They've actually bought it, and then they had to hold that project because they realized they actually didn't have a good handle on what they actually had in their environment. So my suggestion would be you need to have a view of the environment. I think that's critical. It will also give you an idea of how big the problem is. So when we look at, I guess, medical environments in hospitals, so I've got customers that have hundreds and hundreds of VLANs. So if they already have the concept of I guess, some separation or logical separation with VLANs, the question is, are they adhering to it? So being able to identify the devices and which VLANs they're in and who's talking to who gives you a view of what needs to change. For example, if you have an environment where, say, a medical device is talking to a number of devices, but in that same environment, there's a whole bunch of IT devices. The question gets asked is, which one's easier to move? Often it'll be moving the IT devices out of that environment, okay? Because from a clinical perspective, there's a lot of moving parts. So I think from my perspective, having a good foundation of what you have and what's connected, I think is fundamentally important. I do like the idea of kind of crawl, walk, run. Segmentation is it can be a big undertaking, and I think we can do it quite easily with IT devices. They're quite well known, but as soon as we're getting into the other areas, particularly around medical devices, you need clinical context for those tools. Because if we go back to that example, I guess, about the Summit switch, a NAC's going to treat those things as the same. You need to tell it otherwise. So that's my 2 cents.
Thanks, Steve. Now, next question we have from Rachel. I've been raising concerns with our biomed teams, however, have been getting pushback from them as they see security as something that is IT's problem. Any thoughts on how to get them on board?
That's a good question. It's a challenging one because when we look at it, I mean, ultimately, if there's a breach, it's the CISO's head that's on the chopping block. On the flip side, most organisations that I deal with, IT do not touch medical devices. So that's either a biomedical team or an outsourced biomedical provider. So part of the challenge you have is trying to bring those two groups together. One of the things that I've touched on today, which I'm hoping people from an IT side can use to the biomedical people, is you can't provide patient care if a device is compromised. If I ransomware something, there is zero patient care from that device. So ultimately, there will be other things that come in terms of policies and things like that, but it's bringing those two things together. And what I think from my experience is, IT and cyber in particular will have a one view of what a device looks like. So that screen I showed you before with the sort of 3 different views of the same device, I think you need to have the same data set but be able to provide 3 different views. So a biomedical person coming in doesn't see a whole bunch of stuff that they don't understand, but the data is there so that you can actually find a common way to talk about it. So, IT might go, this device with this IP and MAC needs to be updated, and biomedical are going, well, what is that? You need to be able to say, okay, this is a Philips, monitor, or this is a such and such. The other thing that I think is, it's related to utilization, but I think I'm seeing it actually used by cyber. Often utilization data you would think is a biomedical tool, but we've seen it actually used by cyber teams to actually look at the hours that a device is in use and be able to use that to be able to basically proactively go back to biomedical teams and saying, we know this device is not used within these hours or after this time on these days, this device needs to be patched. Okay, so rather than the accepting the pushback from biomedical saying, oh, we can't touch it because it's always in use, the data says it's not. So that's my take on it. You need data to be able to bring the two teams to the table.
Thanks, Steve. I think we're just about out of time now, so I think we'll wrap up the session now. I know that we didn't get enough chance to address some other questions, but our team will respond to that in the coming days. So just a reminder, the recording of today's webinar will be made available to attendees, so keep an eye out for this in your inbox in the coming days. And I encourage you to share the video with any of your colleagues who may not have been able to attend today's webinar. As you know, contact details are on the screen right now. So we can leave that open for another minute or so to give you time to write this down and to also download the PDF handout section in the GoToWebinar control panel. Thank you, everyone, and have a great afternoon. Thank you, Steve. Very insightful. Much appreciated.
Thanks, everyone.